Welcome, everybody, to a Friday Fireside Chat. My guest this week is Jennifer Moss, a journalist, an author, and now a best-selling author of this fantastically timed book called The Burnout Epidemic. And I can't think of a more kind of timely subject for us to be digging into, because there's so many issues involved in the changing workplace, what people are expecting from work. It wasn't perfect before the pandemic, but the pandemic certainly hasn't helped. Yeah. And I think it's really valuable to sort of dig into the ideas that are in the book. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
So maybe a good place to start is just, what got you interested in this subject, and what sort of crystallized it into book form in your mind.
I spent so many years working in workplace happiness. We had actually developed technology. This was way before, before Calm and some of these others, where we were thinking, okay, how do we solve for this through technology, measuring happiness and gathering data and providing interventions? And so we started building this platform. We're really interested in helping organizations develop their well-being strategies, working with Lululemon, for example. We were their happiness consultants. Like, what a cool name.
Happiness consultant. That's great.
Yes. Isn't that a great title? I know we love the work too, but what I started to, come to realize is that after you have worked with enough organizations, that there's a group of people that are really benefiting from those wellness tactics and strategies that motivate them. But there's this huge group of people, too many people that are either just showing up at work. So there's sort of a malaise and they're there, and then they, are weekend warriors, but there's a lot of people that are actually really unwell. And it's impossible to provide them these wellness strategies when they really, it's like giving, ice cream to people when they need water. And so I realized I needed to sort of figure out what that water was, and help people to deal with the stressors that were detracting from their happiness, because there is no way that all of those downstream tactics were going to work for those folks. And, then it led me to the burnout research.
That's fascinating. Well, one of the things you say very early in the book is that I think one of the mistakes employers make is they put it all on the employee, right? So, you were just cited in a recent Time magazine article, right? So it's, let's take a week off. Let's offer yoga at the workplace. Let's blow off steam by playing foosball. And that these are kind of band-aids that a lot of the stressors come from the situation that you're in. And you use a great analogy of, you've got a wonderful chirpy canary and it goes into the coal mine, and it's like, the canary can't help that situation.
No, it's the same thing. And I love that you use that analogy, because I really do think we sort of, use that analogy all the time. That metaphor is so relevant. But this one, for me, it really did make sense in that, we continue to send people back into work sick, even though, we know that they're not responsible for that sickness. And we play a giant, role in our own psychological fitness, our happiness. That's really important. We have to still have life satisfaction, and that, that there's a responsibility that individuals have just in their own well-being. But when it comes to burnout, the root causes are not solved with self-care. And so we need to really understand, as an ecosystem, sort of a we approach the solution. What is the accountability of the employer and the organization and middle management and leaders? Because they play a massive role, in either making our workplace healthy or detracting from our happiness. And so that really is, I think, a key point to the book, that individuals can't be blamed for their own burnout.
Exactly. I think that's so astute, because there is this narrative of, oh, well, if you just meditate, you'll get over it. And yet these pervasive stressors, Jeffrey Pfeffer, a couple of years ago, wrote a wonderful book called Dying for a Paycheck. And he makes the interesting point that, we've done a lot about physical safety in the workplace, that, people don't like, there's rules around like dangerous equipment and stuff like that. But we've done almost nothing about, psychological and emotional safety in the workplace. And I think, and he has a lot of statistics that back that up. And I think your work builds on that just beautifully. So let's move to what some of those structural things are. And if you don't mind, I'd love you to spend just a few minutes on each one of them. So the first one is just sheer workload, people feeling like they just have more work than they can possibly manage.
Well, workload was a leading cause of burnout pre-pandemic. It's always sort of been the leading cause, but then, like a crisis does, it exacerbates existing problems. It shines a big light on the fact that we've been, living in this culture legacy of overwork for far too long. And so now here we are in the pandemic, and we're working, in North America and in Europe, we're looking at about 3 to 4 more hours per day. And in Italy, it's 4+ more hours per day. We're working about 30% more to just hit the same goals that we had before. So none of it has really changed. Like, we haven't really looked at the fact that we're in this macro stressor event that's like our bodies are living in a state of urgency, like it's like a tornado warning or a hurricane warning is going off, all day long into our bodies. And so we're trying to still be able to manage this, business as usual, or even a lot of organizations are in these high growth modes. And the expectation that we can actually achieve those goals is really challenging. And so what we're doing is working more because we're dealing with the inertia, just of our brains moving slower and our bodies feeling sluggish. And then we have this, sort of infiltration of all of those other distractions that are happening as many of us are still working remote. And you add that all up, and then those folks in the front lines that are, dealing with their fear of their own safety and their own health and the health of their families. All of these things should make us pause and say, okay, we need to figure out if this is sustainable. And I think that's why we're seeing so many people leave the workforce, because it isn't for them. It's just too tiring. That's too exhausting.
Well, and I think one of the other issues, and I know we run into this with knowledge work in particular, is there is no completion. There is no end. If I just think about how people have to think about promoting a book, right? You could literally spend every waking minute combing through social media and holding events and doing interviews. And there just is no end to it. And so there's no, to me, for a lot of knowledge work, first of all, do you know who's accomplishing what? And we don't really have a good outcome definition, to me. And I've always felt that people should be judged on kind of the results that they bring. And I've worked with a lot of people who can do that in 4 hours a week, and it's fine. And I've worked with a lot more people who think, oh my God, it's a measure of my self-worth that I'm working 80-hour weeks, and there's got to be some happy median in between, right?
I love that you mentioned that, because that is so accurate. And I've been, talking to these leaders trying to make change in their organizations, and they're finding it so hard because they're trying to move this legacy of, well, I had to work those 80 hours and I was hazed in my first, decade of work. And, so that's what is expected. And so there's a lack of empathy for those folks that are coming in. It's younger generation of workforce and others, and people who, like you and I, who understand how important it is to, reduce the amount of work we're doing every day because it's impacting our mental health. But they look at it like, well, if you're seen in the office or if you're being seen, then you are working hard. And you start to see from the research around these 35-hour work weeks where people, when they have a goal, like you said, they're more efficient in how they get there. If they know that they have this benefit of having this reduced amount of hours that they have to work, so often that being seen and it equating to productivity is really harming people. And so a lot of that just needs to shift. We need to really work hard at those folks that have, yes, they've been through it, but they need to change to adjust to what the expectation is with this newer workforce that's saying, sorry, I don't think that's actually the best way to view productivity and engagement.
Totally. Oh, totally. You see it, you definitely see it with our students who kind of come in, back in the day when we still had internships in person, they'd go into the traditional office and they'd look at the computers and the desktops and the whatever. And they'd be like, No way. And it feeds into another really interesting phenomenon, which is this notion of a tour of duty career, which is, I'll sign up for something and I'll kind of work it through to some natural breakpoint and then I'll move on to something else. And this idea that we've got that, this sort of baby boomer 80-hour-a-week career ladder mindset really has to change.
It absolutely does. And we see a lot of our right now in the data, we did some research through the pandemic and we were able to identify sort of themes that this new, workforce and the largest workforce in history. So they have an impact on how we should be working, but they were coming in and feeling like, they hadn't set any sort of reputation yet. They're working in this pandemic and they have no connection to their boss. They've started their job for the first time inside of this situation where there's no connection and they're feeling like they're not being seen. And for them, that's really, that's scary for them. They feel like their career is being set back.
Well, and Peter Capelli, who is a professor at Wharton, you may know of him. He just wrote a great book. It's called The Future of the Office. And one of his very robust research findings backs up exactly what you're saying, was that people who telecommute or who work fewer hours, who are just not physically around, progress in their careers much more slowly than people who are.
We're really seeing that because you and I have been able to establish who we are, even inside of an organization, people sort of know what our brand is, what our work ethic is. And yet, anyone that's just started and are virtually competing for attention, and leaders are too exhausted too. I've been doing this talk, exhausted leaders leading exhausted teams. I mean, they are so burnt out too, and they're trying to juggle their demands. And so adding an extra meeting on top of all the other virtual meetings to make sure that everyone has visibility is really hard. And so there is some conversations that I've been having around what is the ideal mode of work? Is it where there's some point where you are all gathering and then you can disperse? Is it a couple days a week where you connect with still some flexibility? But our humanity is atrophying a bit. And the things that make us human, like human connection and sharing mirror neurons and, nonverbal communication, all of that is part of our genetic makeup. And so the idea of that being completely lost makes me wonder, around the loneliness and isolation piece, how that's going to play out.
Absolutely. So the second issue, and this has been one that's come up a lot, is lack of control. That's a major source of stress and then consequently burnout.
With the lack of agency piece, I think, and I feel that myself when I have felt like I don't have agency in what I'm doing, that's not healthy for me at all. I like to be able to, decide how I'm going to work, when I'm going to work, when I'm most productive, and which really changes for every person. One person is really, quite productive in the evenings and some early in the mornings. And so this idea of this 9 to 5 way of thinking about work is so, it's actually not optimizing our workforce. And so that is a big part of it. But right now we've seen through the pandemic, micromanaging increasing because we have been, most leaders have not necessarily led in this virtual dynamic. And so they don't necessarily know how to create that opportunity to find out what's going on. And so it's a lot of, we're seeing this sort of control in an uncertain world, which we tend to do as humans. We want to control more things when we don't have control over the big problems. So we're seeing this micromanaging increase. We're also seeing right now with people being told, well, sorry, you're going back to work 5 days a week, even though you've spent 20 months in this new paradigm. People saying, no way, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. I can choose now. I know what it's like not to commute. I have a frame of reference for the capacity for me to pick up, my kids at 3:00 in the afternoon. All these things we've learned now, and you can't go back. And so this is, I think, a big part too of why people are not coming back, because there's been this enforcement mindset around and I hate this term, return to work. I mean, we were working this whole time. We're not returning to work. So, like, that is one of those things that I'm seeing people really fighting back on, because they have had flexibility, and you realize how healthy flexibility really is for a good culture inside of any organization, pre-pandemic and now post-pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that they point out at companies like Netflix is that if leaders are clear about what are the goals, what's your part in achieving those goals, and what's the context, what's the objectives, you can give up control. If you provide enough context, you can actually give up control. And I think for a lot of the companies that I see, it's just sheer strategic sloppiness. They just don't take the time to figure out, first of all, what it is they want to do, and then communicate it to people in a really clear way, so that people can say, oh, if that's what we're trying to achieve, here's how I can help. Here's how I can make a contribution. And
I love that term, strategic sloppiness. I'm stealing that, Rita.
Oh, please do.
It's so true. I mean, it really is so true. And it's also trust. I mean, lack of trust. We tend to, there's been this huge increase in bossware, where there's monitoring software on your computer that's watching you in your house. And I mean, that's just, that software that revenue's gone through the roof. I mean, those kind of things are just, we need to just establish better trust, boundaries, be able to, believe that person that we spend a lot of money attracting, recruiting, retaining, should probably be able to do their job as an independent person. And the strategic sloppiness is a big part of all of this problem.
Yeah. So if I can't explain to you clearly what you're supposed to be doing, so you actually don't know, the next best thing I'll do is monitor your behavior. Which is great. Right?
Which takes up so much of a person's time too. So when you have a boss that's micromanaging, we found that micromanagers are more prone to burnout too. So it isn't just like those who are micromanaged are likely to burn out, but those people that need to have hyper control and end up, being forced into these places where they can't delegate, then they end up burning out as well. So it doesn't work for anyone.
Oh, that's really interesting. So just to continue down the list, because I just think it's so valuable to kind of get these things clearly in front of people. The third one was lack of reward and recognition.
So the reward piece, and I talk about this in the book, Herzberg's Theory of Hygiene and Motivation. And I really love his work. He was mentored by Maslow, which really is interesting because it's this idea of the hierarchy of needs inside of our organizations. And it is just those basic needs. You should just pay people fairly. If they work, 80 hours a week, they should be paid, for the fact that they're working 80 hours a week. It can't just be like, here's your salary, but then we're going to make you feel like you are hazed into working, double the hours you're working. We're seeing that too with shift work and nurses and so many teachers in the last year. It's a bit better now, but they were feeling completely demoralized. They had to do this extra work to prepare for teaching when they had no, they had no understanding. There was no training. So they had to learn on their own, all of those types of groups where you should just make sure that there's fairness there. But then also the rewards piece was really interesting, the research, and Christina Maslach did a bit of work on this. And she's obviously foremost expert in burnout. She's just phenomenal researcher, academic researcher. She's really in that academic space. She was a professor at Berkeley and dug into the data. And what she found was that, we reward people, often the same people, and so you don't see diversity in that recognition. They're always the same type of people. We reward for the same metrics that we've been measuring for so long. It's all based on these sales or production focused metrics instead of human social emotional intelligence metrics, which we should be celebrating more. And so there's that lack of fairness piece that plays into the rewarding of people. Often what she found too in the research, she found that people were rewarding people as a way to top up compensation. And so you also see these hacks that are happening inside of those types of systems. And so I think what really is a problem is that we're not understanding that the old way of, recognizing people is not working. And so then we don't have this morality piece, or we don't have this human-centered piece to how we acknowledge goodness inside the organization. Like we should, have an award for someone that takes a week off and doesn't answer an email. I think like we need to celebrate some of those things that are burnout prevention focused versus just making more money.
One of my guests had a great comment on a piece of advice he got about being a good parent. And what he was told was catch your kids doing something good and reward them for that. And guess
that.
what? You'll get more good stuff repeated.
I love that. We call it positive gossip, so create this, like this positive gossip train inside your company where you're constantly talking behind other people's back about how awesome another person is, and it eventually starts to spread.
That's a great idea.
And when it gets back to that person, they know it's authentic because there was no, aspect of it that was self-serving. It was just to say an awesome thing about another person. And so I think those are the kind of things, that we need to imbue more into our cultures versus, this sort of salesperson of the year award.
Mm-hmm. Well, so much of what gets rewarded in companies, and I talk about this all the time, is really around lagging indicators. It's stuff that is the consequence of actions you might have taken 2 years ago. And so it really, it's not forward looking.
Exactly. I love that. That's exactly it. Where if you can celebrate someone in the moment, and I think more of those types of acknowledgments, and there has been a move towards that. You've seen more of this, these thank you software and technology or platforms that are trying to get people to really appreciate other people. But it is important that we look at a lot of people that we don't necessarily think of to say thank you to, all the unsung heroes, all of the people that do all that work to make those super successful people successful. And so that's why I think that there's so many better ways that we can really acknowledge people, and it is changing, but it does lead to burnout when someone feels a persistent state of overworking, feeling less value for their job, not being recognized for their work. And then they just do it over and over every day to a point where they just think there's no point. And that can create a lot of chronic stress for people. They're like little tiny pebbles that every day just sort of grow. And then you're under this giant boulder and you feel like you're crushed by it.
I love the pebbles analogy.
We need to take the pebbles away, or the spinning plates away from other people. And we do that by not letting them accumulate.
One of the more interesting articles I read recently was about, it was an article that set up a simulated company. It was an article that came out in the Times, and there was a setup of a simulated company, and they simulated people's career progression through the company. And what they manipulated in the simulation was how much a person got recognized, and how much a person's accomplishments were noticed. And they jiggered it so that the male simulated people got, say, recognized 10% more than the female simulated people, let's just say. And what they found is it's pebbles, right? Over time, right? It took the women, double the number of review cycles to get to the same executive levels. And what they showed was just as you got sort of up the hierarchy, with nothing more than statistical manipulation, by the way. This was not like real people talking, but if you just manipulated in the simulation what we found happens in real life, this is the outcome you're going to get. So I think this ties in as well to some of what you write about, because 42% of women relative to 35% of men feeling that burnout was a recent research finding. And I think it's pebbles. It's absolutely that. It's like, you have to outperform, right? In a big way and all that other stuff.
Yeah, well, and there's more exhaustion. I mean, which is one of the three big signs of burnout is just that level of exhaustion. And, and women are more burned out. They have been pre-pandemic. They were disproportionately impacted during the pandemic, added about 15 to 20 hours of unpaid labor this year. And so when you think about just the fact then you have to work harder in your role to get acknowledgements. I mean, there's just all these, again, all these barriers that pull people into the space of burnout and makes it almost impossible to avoid it, just because of these systematic pressures. And again, makes the point that you can't solve burnout by yourself.
Right.
There's a lot of things that are at play here.
So poor relationships was another one. And I think that is very consistent with what we've been talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, the Q12, Gallup's Q12, they're so big on the best friend at work. Well, there's a big reason for that, and it's not even just having a bunch of friends. It really is just that one person. I love how positive psychologists describe it as an effortless state of belonging. That person in your life that is just, it's so effortless. And if you have someone that you can really rely on as an ally at work, it reduces burnout by 41%. So it's quite significant. And you have all these other benefits. You are more likely to feel heard. You feel more psychologically safe. You feel like you're more likely to be promoted just by having one best friend at work. And you also handle, you have better stress management. So it trickles out into your, everyday life. So all of these things of just having this one friend at work is really consequential. But if you don't have any friends at work, which a lot of people don't necessarily feel that in this environment right now. We saw in our data about 50% of the respondents said that they were feeling disconnected from their coworkers. I mean, that's a pretty big number to think that, 1 in 2 people don't feel like connected to anyone at work. And when you look at the benefits of it, it's a real harm, to our culture and to our organization. You really do see people, then that loneliness piece at work play out and into their lives. And when you look at the fact that, so many people are single occupancy dwellers now inside of these urban centers, a younger workforce are feeling very alone. They get their friendships from work. Sometimes people meet their husbands and wives or spouses or mates, at work. Their friendships are built there. So we've really felt it. The last data point that we took, we found 74% of people felt the loneliest they've ever felt in their lives. And so that to me feels like a dramatic stat, and that we need to be focusing on that inside of our workplaces.
Really interesting. And then lack of fairness.
So the lack of fairness piece, you can imagine, Rita, has been just a growing problem for so long. I know we talk more than ever about diversity inclusion and having, those folks there that are actually leading the charge in that in our organizations. But often we don't think about the diversity inclusion strategies as part of the burnout prevention strategies, because there is really a huge tie there, and if you have felt a lack of agency and this polarization in your external world because you're feeling marginalized or vulnerable, or you're in a group that is, this group versus that group, we also just have, everyone right now in these different, planes of political views and views on the pandemic. I mean, we've really created this disconnect with each other. And so then you go inside of an organization and someone is consistently being promoted over you or rewarded or recognized over you. And you feel consistently that you have to do triple time to be heard. You're a female that has been doing 20 hours of extra unpaid labor every week because there's not effective family planning inside of organizations. There's no equity. You are, you're in an organization that suggests, a perk is freezing your eggs. I mean, those are the kind of things that I think is hideous. And, we just put so much onus on these, women and on vulnerable groups to sort of have to step up or work overtime or work harder. And we're not understanding that there's so many other external pressures and stress that's impacting everything. So not only do we have to, do the extra work, we're fighting these barriers that, that we can't even solve for. And so that is something that we've seen in this last, several years when it comes to burnout really impacting a lot of people. And that's why there's an exodus again of certain types of groups of people leaving the workforce entirely. And that's a real macroeconomic problem.
Oh, it's huge. And I think the point that many of my colleagues have made is, so companies are good at box ticking, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, I brought in the following
Yes.
underrepresented people or whatever it is. And then they don't do the inclusion part. It's like
Right.
just having the person occupying a space in your office does not mean that you're getting the benefit of the diversity. And my late colleague, Kathy Phillips, has a fabulous article, which I can circulate to anybody who's interested, called Why Diversity Makes Us Smarter. And her research actually shows that when you have to work with diverse perspectives, it's harder. It's harder. You have to work at it, right? But it activates a part of your brain that actually contributes to creative problem solving. And so, the easiest thing to do is just fill your world with people who look just like you and think the same way you do. But that's just lazy, right? At some point, you really need to take advantage of diversity. And that brings me to the last one, which is values mismatch.
So the idea, so there's values and skills mismatch. So one of the key indicators of burnout is disengagement, and not in the way that we think of engagement and how it's measured, but the way that it really is identified in the research is emotionally distanced from one's work. So that feeling where you spent all this time to become a nurse and you've worked really hard to get there, or become a doctor or a lawyer. And then you get there and the workload is so astronomical and the expectations are so astronomical. You think, why am I here? But you forget the goal. You forget that the end stakeholder is the patient, or as a teacher, the student, or, you just love the law. And we've seen a lot of that this year, where people are sort of, they don't connect anymore to those values because they're so overworked. And that inspiration piece is actually a prophylaxis to burnout. Purpose-driven work does help us create a buffer to burning out, but not if that, passion becomes obsessive versus harmonious. And we are so, a lot of caregivers too, and why you see suicide rates for female physicians 130% above the average. I mean, it's unbelievable because there's compassion fatigue and empathy fatigue. And we as caregivers, in certain professions, the stakeholder matters so much. And so when we feel misaligned with that, that can be the thing that was keeping us going. And we are seeing an increase in that. And then just the skills piece, in our hierarchical system, we move people up into these roles, and it seems to be often, some organizations are figuring it out, but very few. It's like, okay, you've now moved up. Let's make you a people leader. Even though you're excellent at individual contributing, you're really good, you are a leader persona, but now we're going to make you become a manager and no longer a leader. And there's two very sort of different ways of thinking about it. Some people are really good at managing people, and, you take on a different role set. But why, do we feel like everyone that's equal? People leadership means hierarchy, means you're being promoted and moving up. And so that is something that I've seen really impact people, where they suck at people leadership, but they're an amazing leader, and so that is one of those things where the mismatch equals burnout.
I could totally see that. So what are we going to do? And what are some of the things that are in the control of organizations to take action on?
There's tons in their control. This is a macro complex, complicated problem with lots of moving parts. And some things are just not in our control, like the pandemic, we can't solve for that, which for us solutions-based people, it's really frustrating. But we can't solve for that. So that is frustrating, but yet we can still do so much to fix it. A lot of it is thinking about it. I like to sort of think about organizations like a brain. We wire and rewire our brain so that we can adapt to change. We reorganize and organize and change based on our patterns and habits. And it's all very small micro changes over time. That's who you become. Organization, same thing. It's how we organize and reorganize the things that we deem our priorities. So if we really prioritize empathetic leadership or human-centered leadership, and everyone behaves that way, because it can't just be like one neural wiring, firing on and off, and no one else is actually engaging in that, nothing will change. So everything has to be, sort of centered around that concept. And then if you think about, how you create these patterns of change, it's just by in small ways,
So it's reverse pebbles.
Reverse pebbles. And actually it's basically like keeping the pebbles as manageable pebbles, because then you're more aware of them. And a lot of that is, database feedback and leadership. And I have this real, push to minimize a whole bunch of other crappy meetings and stop doing, meetings that take too long and don't go over time, and, reduce your calendar. But I do say to add this one meeting on, which is every week we need to gather together in our team with our manager and be able to say, these three things. And I mentioned that in the Time magazine as well, but in the article, but in the book, I really focus on these micro-targeted ways. And one of them is, how are you doing? Just simply, are you okay? If someone says I'm fine, they probably don't mean it. There's a stat that we say we're fine 14 times a week and only mean it 19% of the time. So we don't really mean it. So it has to be like, I'm fine. No, are you really? And then we need to say, what were your highs and lows? People might not say anything personal for a while, but if it's consistent, it's all about consistency and frequency, to build trust. If we ask this every week, then people start to share. I'm tired. I'm dealing with putting my mom in a home. I've got a kid that's been sick, or I had to quarantine for 2 weeks because, of a COVID test of a family friend's kid. I mean, there's so much that's going on. So find these things out. And then the third response and question that you really have to focus on, which is the big moment here, is, what can I do for you to make next week easier? What can we do for each other as a team to make next week easier? What can I do as a manager to make next week easier? I mean, it's very simple. And this is the opportunity for us to be catching things before it gets too delayed. We need to have more anonymous feedback gathering. We need to have less monologue. We need to have leadership be accessible, have AMAs, make them available to answer any question that anyone wants to have, so you can get to the bottom of these things. It's really just about, reducing inefficiencies and workload by checking in more, more frequency and consistency. You can find if people are working on some project that they think is urgent and it's not, way before they've spent a whole bunch of time working on it and it's been a huge waste of their time. So all of these little tiny things, and in the book, I share a million examples, but here are just sort of the idea that it's possible. We can be hopeful about it because the change is possible, and we just have to do very small things every single day to make that change eventual.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I've been speculating about a lot is we're really seeing this systemic change in economics, which then flows into work, which is value, right, is increasingly going from products and services and, the attributes of something that you might measure in a marketing class, right? But it's increasingly shifting towards interactions and experiences. And one of the things I'm intrigued by is, if you think about the world of work, are we really moving from kind of a factory model where, it's the 40-hour week or the 35-hour week, and it's the, you come in at this time and you leave at that time. And it's like the mental image I have is, this sort of production model, right? And that's in many cases the way that we've thought about work. And wouldn't it be interesting if we said instead, what if work were more of a flow? Like, what if work were more of an as a service kind of thing? And, there are examples of organizations that already work that way. And where people really do feel, they check in with each other. They may be virtual, they may be remote. But one of the things an entrepreneur friend of mine talks about is two things. He talks about follow the talent, because he runs a software company. So, in his case, the talent is very, very, very talented, but that they know, they'll help you figure out what your future direction is. And the second thing he talks about is permissionless organization. And I just think that's fascinating, because what that means is, again, you've set the strategy clearly enough, and you trust your people enough that they don't have to get permission. They don't have, they kind of know what to do. And then if you provide them the resources to go do that, then they can get on with it. It also reduces the amount of overhead. So another kind of design principle that I think is really interesting is Amazon's use of what they call two pizza teams, which is, no team should ever be bigger than can be fed on two pizzas.
I love that. That's so true.
Well, but part of the reason, and I think this feeds into the burnout narrative, is if you've got three people that you're trying to coordinate with, you kind of know what's going on. Like, you touch base a couple of times a day, maybe, and it's easy, right? Like, where were you on that? Oh, I updated this thing, right? So it's easy to keep on top of each other. When you've got a team of, say, 12 people, well, now, it's just more work. And by the time you get to 50 people, and a lot of organizations have teams that big, just the communication burden of what's going on today is so extensive that you can hardly get any work done at all. And I think that contributes to the workload problem. I think it contributes to the time compression problem, and people not knowing what's going on. So that then leads to micromanagement. It's just, it was, if we just kind of rethought what's our basic organizational unit and tried to keep it to those two pizza teams, I think things might be a lot easier.
I love the two pizza teams, and I hadn't heard that one, but that is brilliant. And I think, I do write a big part around that aspect of community being improved based on small teams. And, there was a really great article that was by a developer that was in Scrum Blog, and, they talk about a lot of technical stuff, but I just landed on it because I thought it was really interesting. But basically this idea that you really shouldn't have a team size bigger than 5 ever, and 5 or 6 is the ideal. And then there was some Deloitte research that went into that, really does that, work. And when you have a team of 50, which shocks me that there's still teams of 50 out there. I mean, that's enormous. And there's just so much burden. But what he described is this idea of social loafing. So when you have a team that big, there's people that sort of end up being under the wire. They're not feeling motivated. They sort of don't really do all the work. They don't care to do the work. And so then you have this discord with people that are doing a lot of the work. And when there are others that aren't. When you have a team of 5 or 6 people, you all know what you're working on. There's a lot of accountability. And when you look at burnout prevention, when you have accountability to peers versus a boss or a manager or executive, you're way more likely to feel more valued inside the team, have better communication. You're risking or de-risking burnout just because the teams are so much smaller. So, I really do think that I think 2 pizzas would probably serve our family of 5. So that's probably, appropriate. But the idea that you can be more agile and nimble and feel more effective also plays into why you would feel less stressed and burned out.
Well, and it adds to your sense of agency, because, in a small team like that, your contribution matters.
You play a big
it's very
part.
visible what you're accomplishing and how you're doing
Yes.
it. Definitely. That's interesting. So one of our regulars, Frank, wants to know, when you ask a person, how are you doing? And the person says, I'm fine. What do you do to get past that?
I just say, are you really? And this is what we need to be. This is the pre-work that we do before we ask someone if they're fine. Is we need to be looking for and I had this great interview with the chief of anthropology, which is awesome that there's a C-level anthropologist, corporate anthropologist at ADP. Her name is Dr. Martha Bird, and she's really interesting to talk to you, Rita, if you get a chance to talk to her. She's brilliant. And I talked to her, and she says, you have to be a professional eavesdropper. We have to get really good at listening into what people are saying all the time, reading between the lines. If you've heard that person say, I'm tired, quite a bit, if you've noticed they're withdrawing, have you noticed that they were really high energy and then all of a sudden they seem a bit more irritated, by small things or frustrated? Those are all signs of chronic stress and burnout. And so we have to be looking for those those simple actions. We often misdiagnose burnout as underperforming, but it's really just this chronic stress that's impacted, their capacity to think straight. We make more mistakes. We are, more sick. We don't come in on time because we're so tired. It's hard to get up and motivated in the morning. So we look at this presenteeism and absenteeism as these signs of underperformance, but it's obviously stress. So if we get really good at sort of looking at the semiotics, what people are talking about, what they're saying, I didn't get to go to my cottage on the weekend again, or I was working on Saturday again, or I answered that email from the boss again at midnight. Those are signs that that person is probably overworking. So, Frank, that at that point you would be saying, I noticed, you did take that extra work in, and you mentioned you were working on Saturday. Like, are you doing okay? Is there anything I can do? You're showing you're actively listening, which demonstrates your empathy, and people will feel more trust in answering truthfully.
I love that. I love that. One of the more interesting things about your work here is that I think we have this myth that, like, the higher you get in an organization in a hierarchical sense, that the easier it gets. And there was just a research study that came out looking at the lifespans of CEOs. So this is like cosmic sort of existential stuff going on. And what this study basically found was that if you were a CEO in a situation which they predefined as extremely stressful, so a hostile takeover ploy, or a merger, or an activist investor comes in, or something like that sort of challenges your leadership at a very fundamental level, that it could lop 2 years off your life.
Gosh.
And I just thought, wow, sorry?
Yeah, that's 2 years.
Well, right. And
2 years.
But what I think is so interesting and to some extent empowering is, just because you got the bigger title and the bigger, space and more money and whatever, sure, it solves a bunch of problems because you can probably have more agency in how you decide to work and all this. But it doesn't actually get at some of the issues you raised in the book. I have a very senior colleague at Bristol Myers Squibb, a client of mine, and he said, "Oh yeah, all the employees think I've got it so easy." He said, "It's kind of like Aladdin's genie, right? Yeah. Enormous cosmic power, itty bitty little living space." He said, "My room to
such a good
description." Right?
Yeah, that is so true. And what I do, I love that description because that's what you continue to see. And I've been asking people, when you really think about your deathbed regrets, and when you talk about cosmic existential, really it's so important for us to think about our deathbed regrets. I know that sounds morbid, but more frequently, this email that I'm not going to send out at 11 o'clock at night. Will I regret that on my deathbed? No. These are the things that we need to keep saying. If I say no, that I can't do this other thing because I feel like I should say yes to everything and I should put up my hand for everything. If I don't do this one thing and I miss this one opportunity right now, is that going to be on my deathbed regret? No, most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, it's no. What your deathbed regret would be is that you shave 2 years off your life because you miss your granddaughter's graduation, because that's at that time where those are the, those moments that 2 years can mean the difference of that kind of stuff. And so we have to think about the fact that we are every day sort of resetting our priority scope and making choices based on the bigger picture. And we get pretty myopic when we're very stressed out or when we're in a leadership role, because we do attach a lot of meaning to our work, which there is meaning to the work. But what is more meaningful is having a life well lived and having relationships that are foundational and, feeling like you have a lot of people surrounding you at your deathbed and you're not completely alone. And so those are the things that we need to sort of, in a less morbid way, I guess, reset and then make choices based on them all the time.
I have a little tactical technique that I use. There's a couple that I use. One is called Cancel Elation. which is, okay, just been invited to do something or take some activity or whatever, and your your natural impulse is to say yes. So just stop a minute and say, now imagine, because usually, by the way, these things are all, 2 months from now. And we all make up in our heads that 2 months from now, oh yeah, things will be different. I will have gone to my exercise class. My schedule will have cleared up. My, my life will be much more calm. And so 2 months from now, of course I could fit that in. So then you imagine that you said yes. And then you imagine that it got canceled like the day before. Would you be elated if that was the case? Right. And if that's true, say no.
I love that. I love that. And, I have to tell you that there is a thought pattern that I say too, because I love my job. I love my work. I am a person that if I don't follow my own advice, there is a potential to be ironic. I can't be the burnout expert that's burned out all the time. It's just, I have to walk the talk. So I work hard at it though, because it takes work, because especially in my own role, I make those choices, and that agency is great, but I also make those choices. And I have a hard time not doing certain things because I get very excited about them. Absolutely. And I have to say to myself in that moment, will I still want to do this then? And that cancellation elation is amazing, because it's so true that oftentimes I really wish that I sit there and go, oh, why did I say yes to this? I don't have the time. Mm-hmm. And then something comes at a cost. So I'm going to use that cancellation. Like, it's so perfect.
I love it as a technique. It's just great.
It's so smart. You've given me all these things I'm going to steal now, Rita.
Oh, good. Yeah. That's great. You're welcome to. So do you work with companies to help them sort this all out?
I do. Yeah, I do actually. I did that in the happiness space, took some time really to just don't do the research and write the book. And now I'm back, providing a lot of strategy and really, not in that consulting work as much as more, okay, here is what we need to consider at that kind of high macro level. And then, people go and sort of figure out what they want to attack first, because it's usually a pretty broad problem. Mm. And I do a lot of measure, academic research has been a big part of what was, I think, the underpinnings of all the work that we did before. I really believe in private industry working with an academia. I mean, you get that obviously, and how important it is. And really having the right kind of surveying and evidence. I mean, there's so many ways that people are trying to track burnout within their organizations, or coming up with these simple models, or, survey monkeys being used to ask these questions that are really important for us to diagnose it properly and effectively. So I really push this. Let's ask first. Let's know where people are at. Where is the level of burnout most prominent? What are the 6 root causes? What is the highest, impact? Do you have a whole bunch of people feeling a lack of fairness in your team? That's a very different thing than workload, that we need to be looking at tackling. And so for me, that's really important to diagnose where things are at, and then work on, how we're going to actually intervene. Sorry.
It's okay. One other thing that has been on my mind for a long time is just the quality of jobs that we have in the US. And this is now moving away from sort of white collar kind of office jobs, which I think a lot of us mentally, that's what we were our preference. But, there's I think Zainab Tan put the number at, I want to say it's 37 million. I mean, it's a huge number of jobs that she just describes as terrible jobs. They don't pay well. The hours are unsteady. There's no opportunity for development or advancement. And it seems to me, almost as a society, we've sort of sleepwalked our way into this situation where, if you don't make enough to get by and you're working 2 jobs, of course your performance is going to be awful, and of course you're going to be stressed at work, and you're much more likely to have burnout and I am hopeful. I don't know that there's evidence yet, but I'm really hopeful that what we've been through in the last 2 years is causing people, both personally and organizationally, to reflect on this and say that there's got to be a better way to run a railroad, like paying people almost nothing and having terrible jobs and having so many people burned out and disaffected. It's just not good, and so perhaps there'll be some motivation to begin to make those changes.
I think so. And I really do, when in the book, I write this too about the upskilling, reskilling need. And what the, ILO is really focusing on right now is making automation not a bad thing, that there are some jobs that, that are good to be automated, and robots can do some of that work. And then we can create this opportunity for other people to be trained in jobs that make them feel more, engaged and love what they do. It's going to take a lot of work. And when you really look at the data in the next 5 years, even the amount of jobs that are going to become obsolete and the amount of new jobs coming in, it's a massive number, but it actually ends up being on par. So we need to start thinking about in our organizations, and Amazon's doing a pretty good job of this, and some of the others where they realize, a lot of their parts of their job are going to be automated. So how can they upskill, reskill people into places that make them feel excited? So I do think we need to make work, more fun. Work can be the most incredible fuel. Like, I think of how much I love what I do, and you probably love what you do, and you want everyone to get this juju, this awesome work juice. And unfortunately, there's a very small percentage of people that feel that way in the world and across the global workforce. We want more people to feel that way because we spend 50% of our waking hours of our entire life at work. I mean, that's just giving away, our happiness to something if we don't enjoy it. So I am a big believer in that we need to be creating these environments that make us feel better, feel happier, and that work can do that. But work's just not doing a good job of, and organizations and a lot of, just what is part of our global experience of work, it's just not doing a good job of that. It's sort of failing us.
That's
and I'd like to see that.
But I love that you're pointing some directions. So just as we wrap up, so the book is called The Burnout Epidemic, available, I imagine, wherever books are sold, published by Harvard Business School Press. How can people learn more? So obviously they can read by the book, but what else should they be paying attention to?
Yeah, I write a lot. You can come to my website and Jen, it's jennifer-moss.com. But really, I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn and just talking to people and, encouraging conversation there. And I really love when people come and have these conversations with me where I can have real dialogue, and I'm open to anyone, connecting with me and having those conversations. And I share a lot of the research and the writing that I'm doing on the topic there. So that's probably the best place to find
me. Great. Well, this has been such fun. And we did not know each other before this conversation, but I have a feeling it's to be continued.
It's such kismet. I feel like you're saying all the things in my brain. It's wonderful, Rita.
Well, so thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. Bye, everybody.